Okay, as far as this week, we are in week 5. So what do we have going on? We have another discussion question, right? So your initial post is due Wednesday night. Your peer reviews are due Sunday. You have an NCLEX. And I just once again want to go back and show you that I'm just pulling up the module. Your subcategories to select are right here. Okay. They're all spelled out for you. So don't go in and pick, topics that you like or you do well on, whatever. This is the particular categories we want you to choose your questions. And interestingly, I had a student, I don't know if she was from this class, but send me a question that she could only pull up 25 questions. That's all I would give her. Well, after we did some investigation, it turns out that she didn't put all the subcategories in. And once she put the last one in, it gave her the other 25. So make sure if you don't get a full 50, make sure you have all the subcategories in there. Okay. And then we will have our attestation questions. Let's look and see what they are. What are the 3 elements of the epidemiological triangle? We'll review that in chapter 9. And then within occupational health and the changes in the nature of work. There have been many new occupational hazards. Please identify 3. And we'll cover that in chapter 32, which is occupational nursing. Okay, so those are the questions for today. Do you guys have any questions about this week? Okay, next week is an exam week. So at this time you'll be taking exam 2, same as exam 1. There'll be no changes. I'll send you guys an email out either Friday night or Saturday morning that the exam will be ready to download. So we'll do the same thing as exam 1. It'll be ready to download on Saturday morning with the expectation that you download it before you come to class on Monday. Does that sound good? Any questions? And then next week you'll be doing your attestation on your own. We will cover, let's see, we'll cover, there's only 2 chapters next week, 11 and 12. So I'm going to cover week 6 and week 7. So we'll do week 6 and 7 together. Okay. But I am going to send you everything next weekend to review for week 6. Okay. So after tonight, after today, your whole study guide should be covered. Okay. Because remember our exam covers weeks 3, 4, and 5. So I don't know if anybody's had a chance to review weeks 3 and 4 last week's lecture to the study guide. So I would say about 2/3 of your study guide should be, at least you should have been introduced to the topics, and then we'll finish the rest of those topics today. Okay, so after today, your whole study guide should be, I wouldn't necessarily say completely familiar to you, but at least the topics and the concepts should be introduced to you. Okay, and hopefully you guys can get to a review at the end of the week, Friday, Saturday, or Sunday. Okay, any questions before we get going? None? Okay, cool. Okay, so you got your PowerPoints and case studies and practice application answers and student case study answers. You got that all over the weekend. So that's up to you to hopefully review and be a little bit prepared to come to class today. I'd like to cover the PowerPoint from within the book, and we'll go from there. How's that? So let's start with chapter 6. So when we think of environmental health, well, let me back up. Does anybody have any questions about anything we just covered? Cool. Okay. Environmental health. When you guys think of environmental health, what do you think of? Has anybody ever seen the movie Aaron Brockovich?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
what's Aaron Brockovich about?
About the Flint water, I think.
Yep. Who wants to add to that?
So wasn't she just an average citizen who started working for a lawyer, and she picked up the case and gathered all this evidence and pursued?
What was the case?
That all these families and children were getting cancer and dying
From?
that lived
Dirty
in the,
water.
Keep going.
The chemicals that were spilled out into the water from the plant.
The environmental disaster, right? Water contamination. Okay, so whenever I teach this chapter, I always start with Aaron Brockovich. Okay, Aaron Brockovich was trying to tackle an issue that is of great concern in environmental health, right? Contaminated air, contaminated water, contaminated land, contaminated food. That's what environmental health is. Okay. And here's the four most common risks. Like I just said, air. I'm in the chapter outline of the chapter. Air, water, land, and food. Okay. We have the right to know as citizens and communities what our risks are. This chapter will help us understand how we do a risk assessment. And then we're especially assessing the environmental risk to kids. Okay. How do we reduce the environmental risks? How do we communicate? What is effective risk communication? Who needs to know about environmental risks? How many people need to know? Do you tell everybody and incite panic, or what is the appropriate level of communication that needs to go to people? Ethics. We talk about ethics in every chapter. What are I think about Aaron Brockovich and the ethics that were going on from, I think it was the PG&E, the power plant, or the ethics within that company to try and avoid accountability and responsibility it was unbelievable to watch. Right? How does the government's environmental protection agencies protect communities? Okay, and then advocacy. How do we get involved in advocacy for environmental risk justice? Okay, and then what's our role in environmental health? So again, here's your objectives. We should be able to articulate these objectives after going through this chapter. Okay. Anybody had a chance to review the PowerPoints or any information for this week with chapters 6, 9, and 32? This is actually an interesting week. It's really, epidemiology chapter 9 is kind of lengthy and wordy, but this is an interesting week, talking about environmental. You're kind of looking at big picture, environmental risks, epidemiology within the community. It's pretty interesting. At least I think it's interesting. So, okay, so what we know is that we, as a community, can be exposed to chemical, biological, and radiological exposures, have exposures that will affect our health, right? Any of these exposures can affect the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, and the products that we use, right? So we as nurses need to be able to assess for environmental risks, right? And develop whatever educational preventative interventions to help individuals, families, and communities understand what these risks are. I mean, think about it. Just think about the community you live in now. I live near a highway, a very major highway. So I need to be a little bit more concerned maybe with air pollution. Okay. Some of you may live near the water. Depending on the community we live in and what the risks are, they're going to be different for everybody, but we as communities are not going to avoid any kind of risk. Some people may live close to landfills. Some people may live close to power plants, railroad tracks, highways. Think of all the potential environmental risks that we can, as communities, experience. Okay. Some environmental health competencies for nurses I just wanted to review. You need to have a basic knowledge of what the relationships are between the risks and the individuals. Obviously, some groups in the population are going to be very much more at risk. Say the immunocompromised, the fragile, the elderly, maybe more at risk than the younger, healthier population. Okay. You need to be able to do an assessment, environmental assessment, be able to do referrals for whatever risks you're encountering. Okay. You need to be able to have referral sources. Community needs to access them. And you need to be in a position to be able to provide information to communities about risks. Right. And then another competency is our role in advocacy. Right? Our role in ethics, our role in risk communication, right? We have to be able to communicate to the community what the potential adverse effects are of any risks in the community, environmental risks, right? And we should understand the policy framework and the major pieces of legislation or regulations with regards to environmental health. If you're in public health nursing, you need to know those pieces of legislation. Okay, because they are going to guide your environmental health practice. Okay, Healthy People 2020 has objectives related to environmental health. The 6 of them, we need to know those, right? Some of the environmental health risks. The first one is eliminate elevated blood lead levels in children. That's a real risk in the community, especially the older communities. Older communities with older schools, right? Minimize the risks posed by hazardous sites. Reduce pesticide exposure. Reduce the amount of toxic pollutants. Indoor allergen levels. Think of the old schools, right? Decrease the number of U.S. homes that are found to have lead-based paint. Okay, so we need to know these. Just a couple of types of environmental health sciences. One, we have toxicology, right? Toxicology studies the health effects associated with chemical exposures, right? Second one is epidemiology. We're going to talk about epidemiology next. So whereas toxicology is a science that studies the poisonous effects of chemicals, epidemiology helps us understand the strength of the association between exposures and health effects. Okay. So those are your 2 different kinds of environmental health sciences. Here's your QSIN box for this chapter. Your targeted competency with this chapter is to function effectively within nursing and interprofessional teams, fostering open communication, mutual respect, and shared decision-making to achieve quality client care. This is a really important concept, competency within environmental health. Okay, and your safety question talks about one of the bullet points in Healthy People 2020. This is a good one. Have a look at that QSIN box. Hang on, I'm just letting people in still. Hang on.
Good afternoon.
Pardon me?
I said good afternoon, Professor.
I'm sorry. Say that one more time.
Good afternoon.
Oh, hi, Jennifer.
Yes, it's
Oh,
me.
hi, Jennifer. Welcome. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you.
Water ball makes so much noise. I'm sorry. Okay. And this is a good little visual of climate. This is the section about climate change, climate effects on health. All right. So that is figure 6.3. Right. Impact of climate change on human health. Look at all the categories: severe weather, air pollution, allergens, water quality, environmental degradation. Lots of impacts. Okay. How do we do an environmental health assessment? Okay. Well, we know that we can do this in many, many ways, right? And we've already talked about air, water, soil, food. Those are the four main ones, right? We can also do an assessment by the setting, such as an urban setting versus a rural setting versus suburban setting, right? We can also divide even further, such as functional locations, home, school, workplace, and in the community. So all of these factors provide many, many different kinds of assessments. Okay. So environmental factors, settings, and functional locations are three different ways to conduct a health assessment. I'm going to highlight this right here because what I just talked about is right here. Okay, each of these locations may provide unique environmental exposures and overlapping exposures. So there's your three ways to do an assessment: environmental factors, air, water, soil, food, by setting, and then location. Okay. This is excellent. This how-to box. How do you apply the nursing process, your ADPI, to environmental health? You're not gonna get a much clearer explanation of how to apply your nursing process to any of these topics we're covering in community health. They break it down very specifically in this chapter. Okay, so please have a look at that. Excellent comparison. Okay. And this is excellent. Box 6.2. It's called the I Prepare mnemonic. And this is what we use to take an exposure history. Okay. So I'd like for you to know what each of the letters stand for. You don't need to memorize every bullet point. Okay, but we need to know I prepare, and what is I? Investigate potential exposures. P, you remember you're doing exposure history. So each description next to the letter should be really what you need. So we're investigating potential exposure. So if we're looking for exposure risk, where do you work? Right? Where do you live? Okay, and so on. Environment. What is your living environment? What are the environmental concerns in your living environment? Are there any environmental concerns in your neighborhood? What types of industries are near your home? Do you live near a hazardous waste site? Okay, all right. And what's your past work? What do you like to do? So again, you don't need to memorize all these bullets, but you need to be familiar with what I Prepare stands for. Okay. Make sense? Okay. So this is how you do an exposure history. Okay. And then, hang on, do I need to, hang on. I may need to mute somebody. 1 second. Let me look. We all muted? Okay. Okay. And then it goes into greater detail on the 4 common environmental risks. I really just need you to know what each one is. Potential air pollution, potential soil pollution, potential soil issues, air, water. What do we say? Air, water, food, and soil. Okay. Okay. What I need you to know, what's important to know about air is the 2 categories, point source and non-point. Okay. Point sources are your fixed sites, like smokestacks. Okay. So it's a specific point. Your non-point include vehicles, cars, trucks, buses. Okay. So know the difference between these 2. Okay. Simple point. It's stationary. What else might be some point sources? Think about it.
Areas with a large fire.
Pardon me?
Areas with a large fire, like
Yep. What about some other point or non-point sources? What about fossil fuels? Burning of fossil fuels. What about incineration? Okay. Next is water, right? We know that obviously water is necessary for all forms of life. Okay. There's a great risk of water contamination. Companies dumping waste into waters, right? We know that the quality of the soil is affected by the water supply, right? If there's chemicals in the water, there's going to be chemicals in the soil, right? We know that chemicals in the water and from the treatment systems we have, that all adds to the degradation of the water quality. So the quality of the water is huge. Land. Whoops, sorry. Right? When you think of land, what do you think of? Past and present use of land. What was I reading? I was reading an article about a community recently in New Jersey. Did you guys read this article about all these older, middle-aged people that went to the same high school are now getting sick in their 50s and 60s with different kinds of rare cancers? And they're starting to attribute it back to when the high school was built and the land it was built on and the contaminated land it was built on. And that's just in the last couple of weeks. So that's a whole new breaking story, right? But that's why there's so many rules and regulations about where you can build on. I live close to an old nuclear power plant that's been shut down. They've been trying to build a residential subdivision for 20 years. It's called Rocky Flats, right? They finally did build one. It's on the outskirts of it. But the reason why it took 20 years is because they've been testing soil and testing, under the land to make sure it was safe. Okay. So you have to be careful of the land. Has there been a previous power plant on that land? Has there been a previous waste dump on that as well. And then food. What happens with food? The potential contamination for food. I mean, we just assume we all walk into restaurants and everybody's doing everything right. They're doing meal prep right, food prep, washing, cleaning, everything. We just take it for granted. Right? And there's legislation and health department and everybody's following up with these restaurants. I get it. But there's also a great risk for food contamination, even in your own homes. Right? Foodborne illnesses have been increasing year after year. Okay. Chicken, egg, spinach, hamburger are the most popular foods that we can get sick from. Right? We need to ensure good food prep practices are being done. Cooking temperatures are being monitored. We need to do everything we can to prevent foodborne illnesses. And we know that their environmental risks are posed by the presence of pesticide residues in our food. Right? And then after all that, after all these risks comes the dialogue of having the right to know. Okay, so many environmental statutes give the public the right to know about hazardous chemicals in the environment. Okay, and this is real interesting. One of the right to know laws allows us, as for health professionals and community members, to go into it's obviously the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, right here, is the kind of like the Department of Health and Human Services. Okay, the EPA has all the legislation, all the laws are under them. One of the things they have that's really neat is it's called EnviroFacts. Okay, where you can take your own zip code and you can go put it into the EnviroFacts database, and it will pop up your zip code and it will tell you what are the sources of exposure, data on sources of exposure by your zip code. So try that. Everybody try that. Put in your zip code to EnviroFacts and see what it comes up for exposure within your community. Okay. And then not only as community members and healthcare workers do we have the right to know about environmental risks, but employees have the right to know through the Federal Hazard Communication Standard. All right. They have the right to know what chemicals are in there. What chemicals are they working with or stored? Anybody who works now in environment should have an idea of what an MSDS sheet. Does anybody know what MSDS is? Right?
In our clinic, it was a book that had the chemical formats and the treatment for any hazardous material you came in contact with.
Yep, that's part of the regulations. There has to be a material safety data sheet. That's what it stands for. Okay, it is available to every employee. It's usually posted in the bathrooms or in staff lounges about any of the chemicals that are kept on site, where they're kept, and what the makeup is of them. And if there's a chemical spill, what do? That's mandatory. Okay. And then how do we do a risk assessment? Right. So currently the EPA uses the process of risk assessment when it develops our standards, health-based standards. Okay. And the EPA is the one who is kind of the big picture, big dog. All the regulations and standards come from them. Right. And their term risk assessment refers to the process of the probability of a health threat that could be associated with an exposure. That's what risk assessment means. Okay, the probability. Can you hear background noise? Okay. And then what about children? Assessing environmental risks in kids. Okay. You don't need to memorize this list, but it's really interesting of kids being exposed to this. I'll point out lead because we talk about lead exposure. Lead and potential effects of that. Whoops. Okay. Lead is a very common risk exposure for kids. Okay. Let's see. And then we have our levels of prevention. Okay. Our levels of prevention in this chapter are related to lead exposure. Okay. So what would a primary prevention be? To use only lead-based paint, right? If we're only using, non-lead-based paint, if we're only using non-lead-based paint, then we're trying to prevent any problems, right? Secondary, we're screening, right? If we find lead in the paint, what do? We need to remove the paint and replace it with non-lead paint, right? That's secondary. We're screening, early intervention, early treatment. And then with tertiary, there's been some kind of a lead exposure, right? So would have to take steps to reduce the blood lead levels. You guys understand that? Anybody have any comments about that? Does everybody understand that?
Yes,
Okay.
ma'am.
Okay, and then risk communication. What are we responsible for? We talked about this a little bit ago. Includes a general principle of good communication. Okay, what does this entail for us as the community public nurses? We need to be able to have the right information. Okay, there's 3 things, and we need to know these 3 things. We have to have the right information to the right people at the right time. So the right information includes accurate, relevant, and in a language that your audience understands, right? A good risk assessment is essential information for shaping the message, right? Then we have to make sure we get to the right people, those affected and those who may not be affected but are worried, right? The information about the community is essential, and it should include geographic boundaries. How are we going to get the information to everybody? Is it going to be newspaper, radio, text messages, word of mouth? Maybe alerting schools, churches, community centers? And who can help get that communication out? And then obviously at the right time, right? To try and alleviate some of the fear. Communication is key. You know, when we have emergencies, and you see them on the news, and people are trying to get the information out to the community. There's a whole process within your community that works on, it's part of that emergency disaster preparedness, right? It's not only for weather related disasters, but it's for environmental disasters, right? So you have to be aware of that. And then ethics, right? We always are going to have ethics in every part of nursing, right? Right? When we talk about ethics, certain ethical issues may arise in environmental health decisions. Who has access to the information and when? Right? How complete is the accurate and available information? Who's included in the decision making? What are the priorities? Right? And then how are short and long-term consequences assessed? Okay, then here's a couple of environmental laws if you want to read through them, box 6.6. And then here we get introduced to OSHA. Anybody know what OSHA is? And has anybody had any dealings with OSHA? Really important environmental agency. What is that? What do they do? We'll talk more about this in the occupational chapter in chapter 32. But Occupational Safety and Health Act, okay, that's OSHA, right? OSHA is in place to ensure that we are safe in our workplaces. Okay? They were established to try and provide legislation, guidelines, laws, rules that ensure we work in a very healthy and safety environment, free of risk of chemicals, noise, mechanical dangers, heat or cold extremes. Knowing that we have those in our workplaces, they have guidelines that try and reduce the risk of these potential issues that we may have in the workplace, such as the chemicals and the excessive noise and mechanical dangers and heat and cold. Okay. So that'll come up a few more times in this term, but OSHA is really important to environmental safety. Okay. And then advocacy, right? More than 3 million nurses in the US today. We can and we should be a strong voice for change, right? As informed citizens, as we are, we can help protect the environment for our clients, our patients, our families, and communities, right? We are trusted sources of information, and therefore people rely on us for accurate information. Okay. And then here's some of the roles for us in environmental health. We may wear one of these hats, we may wear all of them. Okay. We're going to be engaging the community and public to participate and helping us, whether it's in reducing the risk, communication, helping to problem solve, helping to do assessments, right? They may be helping us to do population risk assessments. Okay, we're going to be involved in risk communication. We may be involved in epidemiological investigations, which we're going to talk about in a minute here. And we also may be involved in policy development. Okay. There's your practice application exercise if you want to do it in this chapter. And you don't need to go to Evolve. I've already provided you the answers. Okay. So that's an introduction to environmental health. What do you guys think? Let me stop share. Do you typically think about all these things, or do you just kind of take for granted that your risks are minimized in your workplace, in your home, in your living community? What do you guys think? There's a lot that can go on, a lot that can happen. What do you guys think about environmental risks? Anybody been involved in any kind of activities in their community when we talk about environmental health or risks? Or
I mean, COVID kind of. We didn't have enough supplies last year to protect ourselves.
Yeah. Excellent example. Excellent example. Yep. What else?
In my town, all of the surrounding counties bring all their hazardous waste to our neighborhood, and they're trying to extend it. So they're voting to try to get the surrounding counties to keep their hazardous waste in their own counties, so we only deal with ours.
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent example. Excellent.
Yeah, the lead pollution, that's also kind of strange. There's a place that they've known about it. The government knew about it for like 10 years, and they finally just told the people, and the lead was like, it needs to be under 100, and it was like up to thousands or 40,000 times and it was like, what they did was put a sign up that told the kids not to play on the grass, but kids listen to the signs. I don't think so.
No. There's so much that can happen. That's a really sad example of how so much can happen in our environment that we're exposed to. And, for me, I'll speak for myself. I take for granted that the water's clean. I take for granted that the soil and the land that I'm planting flowers in and living on, I just take for granted somebody already checked that out before they built my house. Right? I don't have asthma. And so I take for granted that the air I breathe is clean. But over the years I worked in the schools, it was amazing, the kids with asthma and how they were affected by air quality. So, we take so much for granted, but yet, like going in restaurants, like I said, or our own food preparation, or going to somebody else's house for dinner. You take for granted that everybody's doing everything the right way. Right? But there's so many environmental risks out there. Okay, let's move on to epidemiology. Yay, epidemiology, everybody's favorite subject, right? We'll cover a few things in this chapter. We're moving to chapter 9. Why do you think epidemiology? First of all, what is epidemiology? Why do you guys think it's important in community nursing? What is it?
Epidemiology is isn't it basically just a study of what protects us, like skin and such?
Well, it studies about how certain things are going to affect our health, like say COVID. How a particular issue is going to affect our health. That's what we've been doing for 2 years is epidemiological studies for COVID, right? So our basic concepts in epidemiology, we're measuring morbidity and mortality. Okay, we're going to talk about the epidemiological triangle. There's 3 parts to it: agent, host, and environment. And then the other thing that's important in this chapter is our levels of prevention. It's important in every chapter, but we highlight it, more so in this chapter. And then screening. What's reliability versus validity? And then what are some basic methods in epidemiology? What are the sources of our data? Rate adjustment, comparison groups. And then we'll need to understand the difference between descriptive and analytic epidemiology. Okay, so basically, I'm just in the outline here, but basically descriptive is who got it, who, what, where, when, who got it, when did they get it, what time did they get it? It's all the description. It's the description of who got COVID, where did they get it, what time did they get it? And then analytic is analyzing. So it's the why. Why did it happen? And these are the different studies we do in analytic epidemiology to figure out why did it happen. So that's the basic difference between the two of them: descriptive, who, what, where, when. And then analytic is why. And in order to answer why, here's 5 different kinds of studies we could potentially do to answer why. Make sense? And I'm really going to minimize what we pull out of this chapter because this can get really wordy and really confusing. Okay? And if you're not into epidemiology, then this can get really boring quickly. So I'm going to try and keep you engaged here. Okay? Here's your objectives. Okay? Difference between descriptive and analytic, we're going to cover. Discuss the steps in the epidemiological process. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the epidemiological triangle. Okay. So let's get going. Okay, they mentioned descriptive and analytic a lot in this chapter. So I want to try and minimize the areas where I highlight this, because there's a whole section towards the middle of this chapter that goes through descriptive and analytic. Okay. And so what I said in terms of what, who, when, where, descriptive, what is the outcome? Who is affected? Where are they? When did the events occur? That's all descriptions. Okay. And the other thing too is go back to your PowerPoint. Your PowerPoint has an excellent slide that talks about descriptive and analytic and analytic. Okay. Okay, right off the bat, we talk about Healthy People 2020 and their objectives with regards to their epidemiologic objectives in Healthy People 2020. Okay. So please know these four, right? Reduce MRSA infections, increase prevention behaviors in persons at high risk for diabetes. Okay. So how do we use epidemiology? Okay, this is really important. Page 150. I'm going to read through this. Nurses play a key role in the community's interdisciplinary team, looking into health, disease causation, and how to both prevent and treat illness. This is a really good summary of nursing and epidemiology, right? Nurses, so please highlight this or make note to read this. Nurses use epidemiology in the community to examine factors that may affect individual, family, and population groups, because it is way more difficult to control these factors in the community than it is in a hospital, right? In the community, it's real difficult to control the environment, including the water, food supplies, air quality conditions, disposal of garbage, trash, insects and animals that may carry infectious diseases, and the quality of paint that's used, right, to assure there's no lead, right? So therefore, if you're comparing the community to, say, the hospital setting, the community residents are often much more exposed to many more factors affecting their health than, say, a hospital setting. Would you agree with that? Here's your case study for this chapter. That I've already given you the answers to. Okay, so what are some basic concepts in epidemiology? Okay. Well, the first basic concept is it measures morbidity and mortality. How do we do that? It's done by, and this is where it can get really confusing, so I'm going to try and be very specific. Okay. In order to measure morbidity and mortality, we look at rates, proportions, and risks. Okay. And I just want you to read, we're just going to read a small definition of each. Okay. Proportion is the type of ratio in which the denominator includes the numerator. Okay. We're going to go, you know what? We're going to go to a box that's going to explain this. Okay. The rate is the measure of the frequency that the health event is going to occur in certain periods. And then the risk, we're on page 151, is it's risk. What's risk? The probability the event will occur. Okay, so the rate is the frequency, the risk is the probability it will occur, and the proportion is how many people are going to be affected. It's as simple as I can explain it. Okay, Okay. I want you to know box 9.2. This is our common mortality rates. Okay. This seems overwhelming, but it's not. So for example, let's look at the case fatality rate. Okay. Number of deaths from a specific disease, the number of people diagnosed. So let's see. We had 100 deaths in 1,000 people diagnosed. That's how you get your case fatality rate, right? Let's go back up here. How do you get a crude mortality death rate? Okay. Number of deaths from any cause during a time interval by the population. Okay. So example, there were 2.4 million deaths in a total of 275 million of a population. So it would be 873 per 100,000 deaths. Does that make sense? How do you do a age specific rate, right? So number of deaths among kids 10 to 18 versus the number of population of kids 10 to 18. Make sense? So we had 25 suicide deaths in the 10 to 18 ratio with a population of 1 million 10 to 18-year-olds. We had 25 deaths. That's how you get your age specific rate. Does that make sense? So you may be given a scenario of one of these and it says, how do you calculate it? Is this trying to calculate a crude mortality rate? Is it trying to calculate an age specific rate? Is it a case fatality rate? Right? So let's go back. I forgot to mention this is the case fatality rate. So number of deaths from, say, breast cancer. Okay. So 87, if 87 of every 100 people diagnosed with lung cancer die within 5 years, the 5-year case fatality rate is 87%. Do you guys get that? Okay. I don't want to make it too complicated. And here's how we do. We hear about infant mortality rates. How do we do that? Number of deaths of infants under a year of age per the number of live births in that same year. So if there were 28,000 deaths in 4 million live births, it would be a 6.9 per 1,000 live births. Okay. Okay, let's talk about the epidemiological triangle. Page 155. Okay, epidemiological triangle. Tri obviously means 3. Includes three complex relationships. Okay. We have to have an agent, we have to have a host, and obviously the environment contributes to what's going on. Okay. So the agent is what's causing it? Is it a bacteria? Is it a virus? Is it COVID? And then the host, you have to have a susceptible person that's capable of being infected. Okay, and then the environment is obviously present, but how does that environment contribute to the agent and the host? Does it enhance it, or does it minimize the risk? Does it increase the risk? Right? So For example, let's, I use COVID. Okay. Let's say you're elderly and you're living in a nursing home. Were you more susceptible to getting sicker from COVID than, say, a high school kid? Yes, of course. Okay. So if you're an age, if the agent is COVID and the host is an elderly person living in a nursing home or living at home, just living just their age, whatever their environment was, either increase their risk or decrease their risk. All right. Let's say one of your parents got COVID. Well, a parent got COVID. Okay, the agent's COVID, the host is the mom living in the house. Okay, and there's kids living in the house now. Does the environment suggest that everybody's going to be more at risk for getting COVID? Yeah. So the agent can help or hurt. All right. So here's an excellent box, 9.1, of examples of agent, host, and environmental factors. Okay, and remember, this is presented, they all go together, and it's presented as them all three having complex relationships. So think of all the formulas that can come out of an agent, a host, and environment. Numerous. So we have to look at them all together. Okay, so some examples of an agent: bacteria, viruses. You are going to get asked about this on exam too. So you need to know what each of these entail, right? Agents could be chemical agents, toxic chemicals, pesticides, radiation, heat, cold, machinery, right? And then your host, you have to have somebody susceptible. Okay. What about age? Are you more, is age a detrimental factor? Is your sex a detrimental factor? Is your immunological status a factor? Is your lifestyle choices a factor? Are you obese? Are you, hang on one second, guys, 1 second. Let me just pause for one quick second. So anyway, sorry about that. So host, what is that susceptible person? How much at risk are they? Are they unhealthy to begin with? Or are they healthy to begin with? And then your environment, many factors there. What's the climate of the environment? That could affect it. Plant and animal life, human population distribution, crowding, social support, education, resources, access, levels of stress, noise, satisfaction. What does your workplace look like? Is it a stressful environment? Does it have a lot of risks? So we call all these complex interrelationships that can decide on how the epidemiological triangle affects everybody. It's called the web of causality. Okay. And just think of it as a web. Think of it as, a circle with all these tentacles, and let's say the agent in the middle is COVID. Think of all the things that can happen with a host, all the things that can happen with an environment to make you more susceptible or least susceptible of getting sick. Okay. Web of causality recognizes the complex interrelationships of these factors. Okay, which will increase or decrease the risk for disease. Okay, and then it goes to levels of prevention. Okay. And we'll go to the box and do that. Here's your practice application for this chapter and your case study, both on page 156. And if you again need a better, more detailed understanding of primary, secondary, and tertiary, you can read right here. I'm going to jump down to the box that summarizes them, but here's an excellent page 156 talks about primary. Secondary, I'm still on 156. And these are all obviously described with epidemiological in focus, epidemiology in focus. And then there's your tertiary. Okay. And then we need to know the difference between reliability and validity. Okay. What is reliability? Right? Precision. Okay. Consistency, repeatability. How is it reliable? Right? How reliable is it? And then how valid is it? Sensitivity and specificity is what validity is, right? So we need to know the differences between those two. Okay. Okay, let's see. And then here's where they talk about in more detail descriptive and analytic epidemiology. Remember descriptive, right? And it goes through each of them. Person, who was infected? Where were they infected? And when were they infected? Okay, so person, place, and time. Okay, those are your three characteristics of descriptive epidemiology. Okay. And then analytic epidemiology is the how did it happen and the why. Okay. So those you could read through that page 162 and 163, and then table 9.3 we need to know as well. This is the study design. So this is if we're a nurse and we are in public health and we are participating in epidemiology, there are certain designs that we might want to use. The most common design, so there's 3, 4, 5, there's 5 here. We just need to know a short description of each of them. Okay. So for nurses, we typically use the ecologic design. It's quick, it's easy, and it's inexpensive. And it's usually kind of a first time study. Easy, quick, ready. We use readily available data. Okay. So this is the most popular for nurses, the ecologic. Okay. And then you have a few more. You have a cross-sectional, you have a case control, a prospective, and a retrospective. Okay, so you may get asked a question or presented a scenario in which of a study, and it will ask you which design are you using? Which design should you use? So you just need to have a basic, quick, one sentence understanding of which each of these are. Okay, so these are epidemiological study designs that we potentially use if we're participating in epidemiological studies, if we're in public health. Okay. And then it goes through each one of them. So if you're not understanding it from here, from table 9.3, it then goes into a description of each one. All right. What do we think a retrospective study is? What does that mean? These studies, go ahead.
He's looking at the past and
Exactly.
reviewing what had happened.
Yep. So these studies rely on existing records such as employment, insurance, hospital records, right? To define, remember, defining who's been exposed or unexposed at the time in the past. At some time in the past, if they were exposed. Let's say there was a hospital outbreak of, I don't know, hepatitis, MRSA. You have to go back and retrospectively look at who might have been exposed. Make sense? So then it just goes through each one. Okay. And then here's our levels of prevention related to cardiovascular disease it talks about. Okay, and again, they're picking a topic within an epidemiological study for a cardiovascular disease. So primary, discuss how a low-fat diet and the need for regular physical exercise with clients. That's prevention, right? Secondary, implement blood pressure and cholesterol screening. Maybe do a treadmill stress test. And then tertiary is providing cardiac rehab, medication, and surgery for people that already have cardiovascular disease. Targeted competency, here is informatics. A lot of people miss this on the first exam. It was a select all that apply about what are quality and safety education competencies. Okay, informatics, using information and technology to communicate, manage knowledge, mitigate errors, support decision-making. So for us nurses, that's charting, communication with the team members, with doctors, with putting in messages to doctors, communicating online, on paper. Right? Surveillance and monitoring. And there's your practice application. Okay, so that's a quick, not quick, but that's the most targeted, focused I can do for epidemiology without making it more confusing. Okay. Do you feel like you have a basic understanding of nursing participation in epidemiology if you're in public health? Any questions about that? Okay, and here we're going to talk next. We're going to go to chapter 32. We're going to talk about our last kind of specific nursing kind of nurse in the community, and that's occupational health nursing. Anybody know what occupational health nursing is? What's occupational health nursing?
The nursing field designed specifically for the work environment.
The work environment. Occupational health nurses work in work environments. They're the nurses that do the assessments of the risks in the let's say you work in a factory. Those are the nurses that go out and do risk assessments of, do you work in a factory that has very, very warm or very, very cold, or has lots of loud machinery or lots of risks associated with? They're the nurses responsible for risk mitigation in the workplace. We call it OC health, occupational health. Okay, so if you have an injury on the job, who do you go see? An OC health nurse. Okay, it's all about the workplace. This is where OSHA comes up. Anybody know anybody that works at occupational health?
Yeah, my aunt worked for Department of Homeland Security.
Oh, okay. As an occupational health nurse?
Yeah.
Yeah.
She could look, well, you could look straight out of her window and you saw the White House from her office. It's pretty
Wow.
cool.
Very cool. Very cool. Okay, so let's talk about what Occ health nurses do. Okay, here's your objectives. What's the role of the nurse in occupational health? What are the current trends in the American workforce? Okay, and we also use the epidemiological triangle to explain work-related things. How do you complete an occupational health history? And then what's the function of OSHA? Okay. So the scope of occupational nursing is large. Okay, more so than school nursing, more so than parish nursing, more so than, say, hospice nursing. Okay, typically, occupational health nurses work in traditional settings such as manufacturing, industry, service, healthcare facilities, construction sites, government settings. And their scope of practice can be very broad. Okay, and here's some examples of what they can be doing, depending on where you're working, what environment you're working in. Okay, so here's all the hats they potentially could wear. Now, if you're working in a rural environment, you're probably doing a lot of these simultaneously. Okay, but here, all the different hats you can wear: primary care, case management, consulting, counseling, all through those. Okay. Okay, we know that workers as well, this section is workers as a population aggregate. Okay, so we have different aggregates in the community. We may have the elderly, we may have the homeless, may have the diabetics. Well, this chapter talks about workers, employees as the population aggregate. Okay. So some of the industries, okay, some of the common industries, traditional manufacturing, right? Say automotive plants, appliances, service industries, banking, healthcare, restaurants, agriculture, construction, high-tech firms. Okay, so that what the nurse needs to understand is what is the characteristics of the workplace. This is the occupational health nurse. Okay. This is important right here. Here's a summary, 563. The demographic trends in the US workforce indicate a changing population aggregate. Okay, that has implications for prevention services targeted to that group. Okay, major changes in the working population are definitely reflected in the increasing numbers of women in the workforce, older individuals in the workforce, and now those with chronic illnesses who are part of the workforce or who have been part of the workforce. Right, and because of the changes in the economy, people living longer, working women, right? These are going to continue to grow over time. Okay, what are some of the characteristics of work? Okay, so we know that over time there's been a dramatic shift in the types of jobs held by workers. Okay, here's a list I want you to know. Okay, this change in the nature of work is accompanied by many new occupational hazards. Okay, so we know we have always had occupational hazards. This list of 6 are considered new occupational hazards. Okay, so if you get asked about this, you know, what are some of the newer occupational hazards? These are them: complex chemicals, nanotechnology, non-ergonomic workstation design, job stress, burnout, exhaustion. Anybody can anybody associate with any of those in your workplace? I can. Well, let's see, I have 3. I can associate with 3 of them. But these are considered the new occupational hazards. Okay, and what do you do about, if you're the occupational nurse, what do you do about this? Okay, so here's application of the epidemiological model, right? This, in this chapter, can be used to understand the relationship between work and health. Okay, so look at the host. Who could the host be in the work environment? All the susceptible people could include the workers and the workers' families. Right? What about the agent? What are people exposed to in their workplace? Biological, chemical, ergonomic, physical, psychosocial risks. And then the environment, you can't predict. It's the environment, all of the other external factors that influence the host and the agent interactions. What's the physical environment? What's the social environment? Okay. This is important to know. What are the 5 categories of work-related hazards? We need to know this. Okay. Okay. Well, we have biological and infectious hazards. Bacteria, funguses, viruses, parasites. We have chemical hazards. You need to be able to identify what each one of those are. If you were given a question that said, which category is this for work-related hazard? Is it a biological hazard? Is it a chemical hazard? Is it a physical hazard? Okay, what are some environmental hazards? Accidents, injuries, strain, discomfort. What if you're lifting all the time? Do you know the proper way to lift? What are some physical hazards? Well, what about radiation, electricity, extreme temperatures, noise that can cause tissue trauma? Those are physical hazards. And then lastly, we have your psychosocial hazards. Stress, emotional strain, interpersonal problems. Right? What if things aren't well at home? What if, I don't know, what if people are going through traumatic events in their life? They're going to bring that to work. How do we assess those risks? The occupational nurse has a big job. Okay. Then it goes through more specifically the age, the host, and the environment. I think if you understand how each of these plays a role in the occupational risks, you don't really need to go back through all of this. Yeah, so each worker represents a host within the worker population group. Right, we know that. Everybody in the workplace is susceptible, right? This is interesting about the agent, which is what job categories, exposures, and associated work-related diseases. All right, look at this. Agricultural workers, they're exposed to pesticides, infectious agents, gases, sunlight. So what potentially may they have for work-related diseases and conditions? Again, you don't need to memorize this at all, but it's extremely, it's really interesting. Like a dry cleaners worker. Well, they've been exposed to solvents. So what might they develop? Maybe liver disease, dermatitis. I found this one interesting, glass workers. They're exposed to heat, solvents, metal powders. What potentially may they develop? Cataracts. So anyway, interesting. It goes, oh, I know. This here, if you understand this, that's great. If you need more information, it goes through each of these below. Okay. First goes through the epidemiological triangle, the host, the agent, environment, and then it goes through the 5 different types of possible exposures: biological, chemical, environmental, physical, and psychosocial. Okay. On-site occupational health and safety programs. This is what the occupational nurse is responsible to do, right? Usually there's a team: occupational health nurse, occupational physician, industrial hygienist, safety professional, right? In your large corporations, it's you have a whole occupational health department. And here's some other people that could be part of your teams: nurses, safety professionals, physical therapists, educators, physical fitness specialists, toxicologists. And this is an interesting box too, box 32.2. What may be the scope of services provided through an OC health safety program? Here's all the things that they may address with their employees, right? Surveillance, do health assessments, right? Retirement, termination, returning to work if they've been out ill, health promotion, health screening, employee assistance programs, worker safety, assessing your job risks. You know, if you're in one job and for some reason you get sick or come up with a disability and you need to come back to work, you may need to be placed in a different role, a more restrictive role. That's what occupational health is all about: reducing disability, reducing risk. Okay. And your levels of prevention. Okay. Page 570. Okay. Provide education and safety in the workplace to prevent injury. Screening. Well, screening for hearing loss resulting from noise levels in your plant. Maybe at a loud manufacturing plant. You're going to have to screen your employees for hearing loss. Tertiary. Let's say they have diabetes. Let's say you have a group of employees that has diabetes. Well, maybe you work with them to ensure that they are administering their insulin appropriately, monitoring their blood sugar to avoid lost work days. You know, let's say the manager comes to you and says, geez, we've had a lot of absent days by a group of employees with diabetes. Can you maybe check in and maybe do an education, maybe do a check-in with them to make sure they know how to take care of themselves, they have enough medication, they know how to monitor their blood sugar, and see if we can get that group back to work. Okay. And then here's your healthy people objectives related to occupational health. Totally makes sense. Reduce work-related injuries. Reduce the rate of injury. Reduce deaths. Reduce deaths from work-related homicides. Reduce work-related assault. And that's the other big thing in occupational health is assessing those psychosocial, right? That fifth psychosocial risk factor. You know, we hear about workplace violence all the time. Right? We see something, we need to say something. How is that occupational nurse monitoring those potentially at-risk employees? And then here's the two agencies that we need to know about involved in occupational health. One is OSHA, we already talked about, and then NEOSH is kind of, I'll talk about them first. They're the big agency that is responsible for conducting research, and they review research findings, and they're the ones who make the recommendations for occupational hazards. Okay, they make the recommendations of what they've found to OSHA. Okay, so they identify it and research occupational safety, health and safety hazards. Right? Then they educate the occupational and safety professionals. So they're the big dogs. Okay, and then they distribute their findings to the OSHA groups. Okay, and so the OSHA group, they are the enforcers. They take all of what NEOSH gives them, the research, the findings, the recommendations, and they enforce those. They're responsible for, so when your company, when your employer has an OSHA visit, everybody flips out, right? Just like JCMH? Joint Commission. Okay, everybody flips out. Well, same with an OSHA, but OSHA typically comes unannounced. Okay, so OSHA is a big deal as well. Right? So OSHA, state OSHA departments take what the National Institute, the NEOSH, their recommendations and implement them and make sure they're being followed. Okay, so they're determining and setting standards based on the research. They're enforcing the occupational health standards. They're educating their employees about occupational health and safety. Right? They develop, they maintain a database of work-related injuries, illnesses, and deaths. So every time somebody gets injured at work, you are required to report that to OSHA. If that comes out, if they come out and do a visit after that, that's their prerogative. Or let's say there's a series of injuries. Let's say, and this happened at one of my schools a couple of years ago, there were like, throughout the winter, a couple of months in the winter, there were like 6, and I was one of them. There were like 6 people falling on the sidewalks going in from ice and snow. Half of us had concussions, half of us were out of work. It was crazy. Well, it turns out that the person that was supposed to be taking care of the grounds was not shoveling, was not putting down whatever material that needs to be to melt the snow, the ice and everything. And people were slipping and falling. And it ended up being an OSHA issue for our district. And apparently it was going on at 2 other schools that this particular employee was responsible for as well. Anyway, that's a real life example of OSHA getting involved. Why are all these people falling? Why do people have concussions? Well, because everybody's falling, whacking their heads because of ice, because the school's not properly set up for employees to enter the school. Does that make sense? I ended up with a pretty decent concussion, actually. And I fell twice in the same day. Whacked my head in the same place. It's awful. Anyway, that's what OSHA does. So OSHA comes in. I mean, obviously, you know, we know that NEOSH has provided standards of safety for entering workplaces, clearing sidewalks, putting whatever down. Well, OSHA had to get involved because this particular school and a few others were not following the the guidelines and there were injuries. So anyway, talked about that. There's your practice application. So that's your intro to occupational health and occupational health nursing. Do you have a better understanding of that? What are you guys thinking? Tell me what you're thinking about all the chapters we covered today: environmental health, epidemiology, and occupational health. What are you guys thinking? Helpful? Does it give you a broader perspective of the community health nurse, of things that they're responsible for? And just think, 5 weeks ago, when I asked you guys, what does a community health nurse do? Everybody was kind of quiet, right? We typically thought of home health. They go do home health visits. And so week after week, you're learning that they do a lot more than home health visits. Okay. Does anybody have any questions? Nope. I'm going to give you 20 minutes of the gift of time. Actually, before we do that, let's go to our week 5 attestation. Let's go to that. Let's get that done for you guys. And is the first question the analytic and descriptive? Or is that the second question?
First question is the three areas of the triangle.
Oh, okay. So what are they? What do you have to have?
Host, agent, environment.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. And then what is the agent? You have to have an agent to infect somebody. So the agent is the
Disease, the infection, the virus.
infection, virus, bacteria, right?
Could also like dust, mold, that could be an
Absolutely.
agent.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And that's what, think of all the kids with allergies, people with allergies. Have to have an agent that your host is your susceptible person. So if you have allergies, your agent may be dust or pollen, but your host is a susceptible person. Remember that a susceptible person, your host, can include somebody with an immunological issue, cancer, chemotherapy. Okay, so if you're that host, you're much more at risk. So your agent is what you're infected with. Your host is us. You have to have somebody to infect. And then environment. Who knows what environment, who knows how that's going to play in, right? Depends. That's kind of the wild card. Internal environment, external environment. Those factors will play into the host and the agent. So I think of the environment as the wild card. Depending on what's going on, will enhance the risk or decrease the risk. Okay. Everybody get that? So the second one must be the difference between analytic and descriptive. So let's do the first one, descriptive. What's that? Think of it as describing. You're describing what's happening. Who got it? When did they get it? What time did they get it?
Hey, Professor, the second one says within occupational health and changes in the nature of work, there have been many new occupational hazards identified.
Oh.
Please name 3.
Oh, sorry. Okay. I thought it was analytic and script. Okay. So we went through those 5 new ones. What were they?
So like the complex chemicals, nanotechnology, job stress, burnout, exhaustion.
Alex has them right there.
page 563, the top.
Awesome. Thank you. So we're looking for what are the new ones. I mean, these have always been there, but they are certainly moving, playing a much more important role. I mean, we always think of stress, but look what stress is part of the work environment, but look what stress has caused in recent years. Burnout. I mean, what happens if you don't get a job promotion? What happens if you don't get the pay raise? What happens if you don't get along with a coworker? And bad things are happening in a workplace. We see it every day. So did everybody get Alex's answer? And you just need to name 3 of them. And then hit submit. And then you're all done with that. So does anybody have any questions about today's material? Do you have a better understanding of each? Okay, pull out that study guide. Let's see, this week, well, do you have any exams this week? What do you have this week? I thought you had,
Med-surg.
you have a med-surg exam this week. Last week was peds, the week before was community. Okay, all right, so med-surg this week, and then when that's over, pull out your community study guide and start at least checking off. Yeah, I heard that before. Yes, she went over this. Yes, nope, she didn't go over this. I need to go figure that out. So just at least do an initial run through of the study guide so that you can say, yeah, I'm in good shape. I'm in good shape. Or I'm not in good shape. Okay, so I need to figure out what I need to do. So that would be my suggestion. You know, focus on your med-surg test this week, whenever it is, and then jump over to community. But in the meantime, have a look at your study guide. You're gonna get a good feel from your study guide how well prepared you are before you start really studying for the exam. Does that make sense? Okay, so now I'm going to give you the gift of 15 minutes of time to go get what you need to get done before you go to your PEDS class. Okay, so you guys have a good week. Reach out if you need anything. That's it for me. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Professor. Congratulations on your grandbaby.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.